Hi, this is your host Sabdin Bhartia, and this is the first episode of Dirk and Swap conversation on open source of 2021. And today, once again, we have with us Dirk Honda, VP and Chief Open Source Officer at VMware. Dirk, Happy New Year, and great to have you back on the show.
Happy New Year. Good to be here.
Today, we are going to talk about something which is, I feel, is a critical part of open source software, which is commercialization of open source. Now, in my own early days, every time I hear any commercialization of, I'll get upset. No, this is something that is very, very precious and sacred. It's free software. We should not talk about money. It's open source. But the fact is that as even my own career evolved, I realized that you have to pay bills. I used to be very close to Debian users. I used to be a KDE user. Of course, I would use their project and everything. And when I talk to them, sometime I will come across and see that most of the people, they work in their free time, and they might do something on a weekend or once in a while. And then I also reached a phase where I realized that most of those people, they used to work for Ubuntu because Ubuntu was using Debian, and now it was no longer a hobby project for them. They were getting paid to maintain the code, which also meant that, first of all, they were able to devote more time, actually all of their time, towards the project. The code quality was improved because it was not that they had to find time between the family time, movie time, beer time, or code time. So then I realized that for the sustainability of open source, it's really important that there should be a commercial angle, because with anything else, just forget about the code, anything else. If I'm an artist, I am making painting. If I'm not selling them, what is the point? I'm a writer, I write a script, but nobody's buying it. What is the point? So let's talk about the commercial aspect of open source. Also, what are the ways you can do that? You can also get contribution, but that will not be very effective. But I want to start with the very first thing that we did actually on the very first show, that once you create an open source project, there are 5 users, 10 users, 20 users. After, once the user base grows, you do have to think about commercialization. At what point you should think about it?
So I want to hook into what you just said about the artist, about the writer, because the point very often can be about the art, about people seeing it, about people reading it, without the need to create income from it. And that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable. Similarly, you have people who are gainfully employed and who have open source projects on the side in their spare time, where they very intentionally do not want to have that money changing hands, creating responsibilities and pressures. I mean, look at myself. I do an open source project on the side, and I contribute to quite a few on the side, very intentionally and explicitly not connected to my job. But if you look at a project that has reached a certain level of size, both in the code itself and in its user base, and you ask yourself, how will this project stay sustainable over time? And how will it reach a threshold where it's not the one person, and if that person goes away, the project dies? And one of the most obvious paths to that tends to be a commercialization of the project. And there are many different ways to do that. And that's part of what I thought we can talk about today. But without having a commercial interest in the project, you very often end in a situation where there is a single person or maybe 2 people who carry all the load. And if at some point, due to life changes, their investment declines, or they have to walk away, or heaven forbid, they pass away, the reality of these projects changes dramatically.
If you are a creator of a project, it's not necessary that you are also the party who is going to commercialize it. I mean, Git was created by Linus Torvalds, right? But there are companies like GitHub and GitLab. Kernel was created by him, the company Red Hat, and other companies, they are commercializing it. So the creator of a project doesn't have to have that mindset of commercializing. Others can also commercialize. Is that wrong?
So that is not wrong at all. And it's a very common thing to happen, that you have others that aren't the creator of the project creating the business around that. I mean, if you look at the history of Linux, it wasn't Linus creating these companies. And very often it is this symbiotic relationship where you have people who initially do this for fun, as Linus's autobiography is called, just for fun. They do this because it's interesting, because they want to work on it. And others create a commercial environment around it. And as a result, maybe the founder ends up with an opportunity to be employed themselves, or the founder continues to work on this as a hobby, but there is support from others. There is an infrastructure of maintainers that comes in. There are other people that start contributing and that help push the project along. Because that load on the initial creator, on that initial team, can be balanced by new contributors coming in and taking over many of the core roles that are so time and work intensive, that make it hard to maintain a project by yourself. So to me, commercialization is not about the person who started the project is creating a company. That actually is almost the exception of the rule. You have these cases where project founders turn into entrepreneurs and are successful. And we obviously have a few big ones, JBoss, MySQL, people who were super successful with that, or Tom Hatch for Salt, which VMware acquired, SaltStack, last year, right? So you have these open source creators turned entrepreneurs, and that vector of commercialization. But especially with the larger projects, I think that's actually the exception. I think that's the unusual case. The much more common case is that you have a project that gets started by hobbyists, gets maintained by hobbyists, and then a commercial interest comes in and not necessarily takes over, but helps to maintain these projects. If you look at almost every package that is part of a Linux distribution today, there is a certain amount of engagement by Canonical, Red Hat, SUSE, other companies into these projects. The degree may be different. There may be some projects that really literally are only packaged and nothing else. And some projects actually quite actively push back against this involvement. Again, my own project asked the distros not to package it because that was not how we wanted to interact with our users. But in many, many cases, you see that these corporate developers come into these projects and help make the projects better. And that is one of the many forms, one of the many steps of commercialization. And to me, for a lot of projects, that aspect of commercialization is super healthy for them and is super important to their sustainability, because otherwise they wouldn't have that critical mass that makes them long-term viable.
There are so many things I want to talk about from this, but one thing that you mentioned is that when a commercial player comes into, it's not that they are going to take over the project. Sometimes that is the fear people face, but the fact is that one of the many reasons they were interested in that project was they themselves saw a commercial viability where they can package it a product. So they very much want, why would you want to burn down the crop of your potatoes when you're going to make chips out of that, right? You want that crop to be very, very successful. You do everything to make it more productive. So it's not that commercial vendor come in to destroy a project, but that is sometimes seen, hey, you know what? I don't want to name anybody, but every time Microsoft gets involved, people say, why would they want to destroy Linux kernel when the Linux kernel is, powering their own, servers and devices? That makes no sense. I like what Linus or even Greg say sometimes, that we want selfish users, because selfish users are the ones who are contributing because they see some value in my project. They are not doing out of charity, because charity is something will go away tomorrow when you don't feel like that charitable. So can you little bit, because you have been involved with so many commercial players who get involved with open source project, what kind of mindset they bring to the project, because they look at a project, they want that project to be even more successful. They pump in a lot of money, they dedicate a lot of developer resources, they do a lot of marketing of that project.
I think there's, as always, a broad spectrum of how companies get involved, what they do, how they engage, and how they prioritize their actions. I would not make generic statements that none of them are leeches and that none of them are bad. We've seen companies whose involvement in projects has not been a net positive, and we've talked about this in prior episodes. But in general, if you look at a company that has a product or service that is based on an open source project, now suddenly the health of this project, the sustainability of this project, the response of that project to security issues or to fundamental flaws in the algorithms suddenly becomes a business interest for them. So to them, the fundamental alignment between community interest and company interest is a possibility. The degree of that alignment is really what's the difference between a good corporate citizen and the bad corporate citizen that engages with a project. Because you can have companies that try and go in and say, from now on, only my interests matter and everyone else is irrelevant. What matters is this product, its deliverables, its features, the integration with my other parts. Everyone else go away. That's not sustainable. That's not pro-open source. We do see this happening. But very often what we see happening is a much more synergetic effort where the company sees, here are the key weaknesses. The CI/CD system of this project doesn't catch enough bugs. There isn't enough focus being spent on static analysis, on dynamic analysis, on security. There isn't enough effort in documentation, in use case stories, user stories, how this project can be used. There are key features that are missing. And the company starts engaging there, which then makes the project better. And of course, the more the company or the companies, plural, invest in a project, the more they are invested in the sustainable life of that project, in the continuing health of that project. And so we've seen a number of large projects that were initially completely community driven, where companies have really taken over the vast majority of the development work. The Linux kernel is always a super easy example, because when we started in 1991, every single one of us was a student or a hobbyist or someone doing this on the side. There wasn't a single company involved. There were no Linux vendors. There was nothing there. This was all just hobbyists having some fun. And as time progressed, 1994, 4 years later, 1.0 came out, and we started having Linux vendors, Linux distributors. We're starting to have some people contribute. And by 1999, already 80% of all contributions came from people who were being paid to do that work. And that really is that shift that I'm talking about, where the engagement of the companies really helps the project to be sustainable, but also to become so much better for its users, so much more capable for its users. And that is that goal, that commercialization of open source projects is good, is helpful for the project.
As you were saying earlier, that there are still cases where companies do leech, and there will always be cases in not only just open source and every space, their companies will come, they'll take Wikipedia article and republish as their own article, so yes, there might be cases where abusive companies will be there all the time. But in most cases, companies approach it for a very positive reason, is that they see a value, they see a user base, and they want to cater to the user base. Also, one more thing is with open source, especially, it does solve day one problem, but day two is where the real challenge is. And that's where most companies play a bit. I consume a lot of open source, and I'm saying the word consume because I don't contribute back. So I'm using the word consume. But initially, I would use all the community based. Now I try to use as much as vendor backed, because I don't have time to fix things, patch things. I am willing to pay. All I want is that it's open source so I can switch vendors easily. I'm not logged into vendors. So while there is cynicism, I do see commercialization, mostly the approach in general is positive.
So I think we've seen more of that cynicism and more of that pushback against commercialization from the free software community. And if you look at the creation of the term open source, if you look at the people who tried to pry apart these two terms, a lot of that was about the willingness and the degree of welcomeness of commercialization. A lot of the people behind the idea of open source were all about involving companies into these projects. Now, having said that, even on the open source side, on the far more I need to be careful with terms. I was going to say liberal, but that's likely the wrong term. On the far more willing to embrace commercialization side of this spectrum, we see a lot of people who look at players who only take and don't give as the players they don't want to interact with. And that to me really is the definition of a bad player in this space. And we see this today, companies who take a project, use it, but they don't contribute back in any meaningful fashion. Not through money, not through support, not through contributions, not even through bug reports. Nothing. They just take. And they will continue to exist, and they will continue to cause problems for all of us in this community. But I think they continue to be the exception. Yes, there are a couple of egregious cases of doing that, but they continue to be the exception. And the vast majority of players, especially in the enterprise space, are companies who understand that this is a give and take, and who understand that in order for them to be successful, they need these projects to be successful. And if you make the project successful, that means you engage, you contribute.
We also sometimes hear the term open source versus commercial. They do want to call open source software with their commercial software. So they try to use the term open source versus commercial software vis-a-vis. What is the confusion there?
So we see the open core and commercial open source, and there's a lot of very intentional name confusion where people try to get the benefit of being considered open source. So they're the presumption of openness, the presumption of ability to switch vendors, and the presumption of a fair level playing field. Whereas in reality, they don't want any of that. And they're much more interested in a shareware-like environment or a shared source-like environment where they have all the cards, all the control, all the rights, and everyone else is a second-class citizen. So we see that a lot. We see a lot of people very intentionally playing with that. The fact that open source is actually not a trademark term. And we see the open source initiative and more the gray beards in this community pushing back when people try to redefine what open source is. We saw this just recently when the Nmap community suddenly switched the license from GPL to their own custom variation, clearly not written by a lawyer, but written by some engineers, with what I'm sure were good intentions to make that project more successful. But what turned out to be a non-open source license. So the Gen 2 community said, well, you're no longer listed in our license database. And a lot of companies are looking at this and saying, oops, we can't touch this because this is now software that is not actually open source. And so this tendency of communities and companies behind communities to go in, take something that is truly open source and where they have a reasonably successful commercial environment around that and say, oh, this is not enough. We need to prevent others from using this in ways that we don't want, which is a fundamental contradiction to the basic rules of what the open source initiative put up nearly 20 years ago. What does it mean to be open source? There can't be any restriction of endeavors of use. And so we see this every month, it seems like every other week, with projects changing the licenses away, but still claiming to be open source, even though they are in violation of these underlying tenets that many of us believe in. And so that's what you're talking about, that open source, open core, open whatever, the terms are used very often far more broadly around truly commercial proprietary endeavors that just happen to give you access to the sources.
So the point is basically just because you're commercializing something doesn't mean you should change the nature of the software. You are commercializing open source, keep it open source, because the moment you change it, it's no longer open source. So you are no longer commercializing open source.
Create value that is independent from the underlying open source project. Make the open source project useful and valuable, and create incremental value that you can sell on top and around it. Adjacent, connected to it, and don't just think, oh, support and services are my only options. That's not true. There are so many ways to create adjacent value that makes the open source project more accessible to the audiences that are ever going to give you money. I mean, look, if you have a cloud native software component, who's going to give you money? The large enterprises who use this in their production environment, right? So figure out which features are specifically important to them, commercialize those features, and keep the rest of it open source. I mean, that's the underlying philosophy of what we as VMware do in that space. We look at our customers, we go to our customers and say, hey, what other features in this space would be great? What would you like to see? And we look at those and we ask ourselves, is that something that should be core of that infrastructure because it's needed for everything? Or is this something that is specific to an enterprise user? And so the commercialization through a proprietary extension is a much better model because it reflects our investment and the value that they generate from it. But we really drifted quite a lot away from the initial question of sustainability of open source projects very often is improved by bringing in commercial interests. And that really is in a way, a much smaller topic. It's much more about earlier stages, about smaller projects, about much gentler engagement by commercial interests in simply getting involved, helping along, making things better, versus an entity that controls an open source project. So is the initial author, is the copyright holder, and is now suddenly changing licenses in order to further their commercial interest. And by doing though, kills the underlying open source project. Those are really two very different scenarios.
Dirk, thank you so much for talking about this very complicated topic of commercialization. The bottom line is that commercialization is necessary for sustainability of any open source project. Without commercialization, the project will live as long as the creator of the project is interested in the project. If you want your project to survive beyond your free time and your hobby time, there should be a commercial angle behind it. Dirk, once again, thank you.
Thank you, Swap. Good talking to you.